Hello and welcome. I promised I would talk about the 13 Dhutanga practices in a little more detail. So I'll do that now. I won't go into too much detail as they're really designed for monks and nuns, possibly, more than lay practitioners, as you'll soon see when I go through them. So briefly, and then difficulties with teeth allowing, we may continue with some of the comments and questions today. But I also need to continue with investigating what I can do about my tooth problems. I've had two removed, pulled out now, and yesterday I had one filled, and I'm not so sure that the filling was a good option. The dentist did suggest removing it also, or trying filling. The trying filling seems to have created more pain than I had originally. We'll see. Obviously, one can only remove so many, and then you'll have none. Is my theory. And then what do you do, eating wise? It's a bit difficult, this aspect of things living here. So we'll see. Anyway, let's continue with the Dhutanga practices. One of which is not living without modern dentistry being that accessible. Although I have had some offers of assistance by way of email from some dentists or a dentist elsewhere, but I'm not so sure what one can do remotely. Anyway, I'll continue with the investigations maybe later. I've tried focusing just on the pain. I've tried ignoring the pain. The Buddha says with regards to pain, we should really focus in on it and get our attention on it. And this is often a good way of resolving the issue. And if that fails, then we try and ignore it by distracting ourselves with a meditation object. If that fails, we grin and bear it and just put up with it. And if that fails, we get something done about it, or we do something about it. And I'm at the getting something done about it or trying to do something about it stage. So, the 13 Dhutanga practices, the Buddha teaches us the middle way. And as is described in the first sutta, the Dhammacakka Sutta, the middle path is, after much, let's say, research, practice, trial and error, the Buddha came upon the solution to becoming free from suffering in this lifetime, and ultimately, as a result of that, becoming free from rebirth into the next. And the middle way is avoiding the life of luxury, as well as avoiding the life of austerity. Now, in the time of the Buddha, and still today, there are many what are called tapas practices that go on amongst samanas or religious seekers, wandering ascetics, looking to free themselves from suffering by way of extinguishing previous bad karma, by way of also bringing attention to and extinguishing the kilesas, or our defilements of greed, hatred and delusion. And it is thought often by some, as it was then and is still to this day, the way to do this is to put the body and the thinking brain, the mind also, through torment, torture, severe deprivation of its needs. And the Buddha tried this for 6 years, ascetic practices, to no avail, and in the end decided that he must eat something, otherwise his body was about to just give up on him. And he did this, and it was only after a little sustenance and a bit more thought, and then sitting under the Bodhi tree with some comfort but not too much, that he found that middle path, the middle way. So the tapas practices of burning away defilements, burning away bad karma, to some extent have validity in that they take your mind off overindulgence and luxurious living, but can also have the opposite effect of really causing too much suffering for you to become free from that suffering. So we need to look after these physical bodies, and we need to also look after our mental health. And this is a very important aspect of overall the Buddha's teachings, Buddhism and its practice. This is the middle path. But in understanding that monks or nuns have chosen the monastic life by way of speeding up their progress towards Nibbana, freedom from suffering in this lifetime, and attainment of Nibbana, by practicing to some extent austerity by comparison to worldly living, he allowed certain practices of austerity. In the Vinaya rules, the code of conduct for monks and nuns, of which there are 227, a very long list indeed, and perhaps the longest of the lists, other than 311 for nuns, but these 13 Dhutanga practices, as far as my lists to kind of remember or use and research and recall often, is 13, the longest, preceded by the 12 links of dependent origination. Prior to that, I've forgotten 11. 10 is 10 parami, which isn't an official list, but the qualities one develops from the practice throughout our lifetimes as we strive towards enlightenment. And the lists are made up of this nature. I keep them to hand, both in written form, and try to keep them in my mind in memory, because they're like my to-do lists, my ways to practice. And this is the longest to-do list, the 13, but I don't have to remember it. I've got it written down in front of me now, because it is the choice of monks to pick from that list one or two, or a few. Some of them pertain to what we wear, our clothing, some to eating, and some to our accommodation. So they're taking into account really our 4 requisites. The 4 requisites being what are provided to monks, being dependent on lay people, and they are food, clothing, shelter, and medicine. So these Dhutanga practices relate to the first 3, food, clothing, and shelter. And we can choose to take advantage of what's offered, or be a little bit more careful about that, avoid tending towards a life of comfort and dependency on too many things that may be offered out of the kindness and generosity of those supporting us, and employ some strict rules and guidelines for ourselves to maintain, we call the Dhutanga practices. So the tapas, you've heard of tapas bars perhaps, hot chili snacks or something like that, coming from Spanish origins, I think. Tapas practices are just those ways of burning away the defilements which are prohibited to some extent. So standing for the whole of your life with one arm in the air, or standing on one leg, sleeping on beds of nails, only eating 1 grain of rice a day, or complete starvation, complete fasting for days on end, is actually prohibited in the Vinaya for Buddhist monks and nuns. But what is allowed are these 13. So I'll run through them quickly. I'll try and include the Pali word, although it's not so relevant and I can't probably pronounce them correctly. But the first is just rag robes practice. Rag robe wearers' practice is we wear these robes, that's it. They originate from coming from rag robes. Pamsakula, anga. Anga just means practice, I think, in the Pali, but Pamsakula means rag robes. So robes of the nature, they were picked up from charnel grounds, funeral grounds, cloth that was wrapping up dead bodies, and any bits of cloth sewn together to make our robes. And these days they're usually made for us by lay supporters in that fashion, but they're probably made from new cloth and dyed accordingly. But they're all sewn in the original rice paddy field pattern that the Buddha prescribed, being a patchwork design, basically. So this is quite simple. All monks observe Pamsakula, but could take it to its extent in the practice, anga, to only wearing, and there are some, refuse and thrown away rags that they painstakingly themselves have sewn together to form the one robe, this robe we wear. So as far as my checklist is concerned, I can't say check to that in the strictest of sense, because my robes are offered to me in this form already. But moving on to the second triple robe wearer's practice, Te Chivara, or Te Chivarik Anga, is 3 robe wearers practice. I just have the lower robe, upper robe and outer robe, and observe that practice of just having the one set. So check to number 2. This is what applies to what we wear, our clothing, and most monks are observing that, although there will be usually in communities monks that will have extra cloth, extra robes that is acceptable for them to have for practical reasons. But for my practice, I observe the strict discipline of just the 3 robes to keep as close to the original practice of Pamsakula practice as I can, Pamsakula Anga as I can. And I find it more practical just having the one set. When one's in the one part of it's in the wash, you can be wearing the others. I do keep a second lower robe because it's not practical to, you can't cover yourself well with just the upper robe whilst this is washing, cleaning. Then it goes on to food. So alms food, pindapata anga, or pindapatik kanga, is how the Pali word's written in wherever I got this from. Alms food practice. So we rely only on alms food. Now often people rely on food being brought as dana to the monastery, to the temple, to wherever they may be living as a community or even alone. And that's okay also, but you can adopt to just live on what you gain or receive on alms practice going on Pindapata each day. And that's something I've always tried to do where possible, especially as I'm living alone. And it's more practical that way. You can have a more disciplined approach to what you receive. It's all coming into the bowl, and once it's full, you've finished. You return, you eat what's necessary and give away what you don't need. So I observe that one. Check to number 3, observe alms food practice or pindapata each and every day. Now, whilst on alms round, the next few are to do with that. Every house practice, or Sapadanikanga, every house practice. This means when we're on alms round, we don't skip a house. We literally sort of walk, not too slowly, but past each house and accept food from every house. More to the point, what it's referring to, you don't have a list of places where you frequent, you go, where you know you get good supplies, good food, and those that you avoid because you know there's either a barking vicious dog or you particularly don't like the food for some reason or something like that. So you don't have preference. You literally visit each and every property, dwelling place that you pass, with the exception of none. This also has the effect of determining the length of the route, because you're going to be offered more or less in a Buddhist country something from most places, and once you've got enough or a sufficient amount to carry, that is the time to turn around and head back. So every house practice, check, yes, I do that one. Then the way we eat the food, number 5 we're on to, one sessioner practice. We only eat in the one session. This is called in the Pali Ekasanikanga. Eka, one, that's the Pali word for one, Sanikanga practice, one session practice. So when I return with my alms food, I sit down, eat my meal, that's it. I don't then have another meal at lunchtime or prior to that have a meal as a breakfast. I just have the one meal. And this is also summed up one sessioner in some of the other continuing food item Dhutanga practices here. Number 5, that was one sessioner, so check, I do that one. Number 6 is bowl practice, Pata Pindika. So sort of the opposite to Pindapata. Pata means bowl, Pinda from the bowl, food offered into the bowl. So it means I only eat the food from my bowl with no other plates or dishes, side dishes, additional extras, jugs of gravy, sauces, whatever might come along. What's in my bowl is what I eat, and that's the food that I enjoy, and that's the way I eat it. So check one bowl or bowl practice. So you see most of these are much to do with either clothes, as we've just seen, food. So this is how you can see they're not that applicable to lay practitioners, but I suppose it's interesting for you to know what the 13 are as I refer to them, I think, quite often. Then number 7, late refusers practice. It's a very long Pali word with lots of dashes, and I can't really, I'll try. Kalula pacha batikanga. So late, so you've sat down to eat your meal, you've finished, and then someone comes along and offers something else. Actually, if that does happen, out of politeness, I will receive the food on the lid of the bowl, but I probably won't eat it. Apart from the fact I've got enough in my bowl already, as has been determined when selecting what I'm going to eat or leave in my bowl to eat rather than give away. It is one of these Dhutanga practices, number 7. So check, yes, I do that one. But I would receive the food out of politeness because there's someone coming, as it does happen sometimes halfway through the meal, to offer dana on the lid and then put it out to offer to someone else to share with others later. So check, number 7, do that. Then it comes to, that's the food practices out of the way, up to 7. And then number 8, we start moving on to where we live, our accommodation. So, forest practice. This is just living in the forest. Now, this can be really interpreted any way, living in a forest monastery where you might be living in a kuti in the forest. But in the time of the Buddha, this is really referring to just going out to a forest with an umbrella or a mosquito net, perhaps at the very most, to sit under a tree and dwell, practice your meditation, return to for eating your alms food once collected, but still you're going to be within walking distance of a village, a town, somewhere to go on alms round, and dwelling alone in the forest. Really, I'm not in a forest here. It's a little jungly, but it wouldn't be considered as forest practice. I'm in a building, which we'll come to later, so we don't check that one. Number 9 is tree root practice, and this is literally living under the shade of a tree. A bit like forest practice, but just some trees. In the Vinaya, we can't sit under a tree and live under a tree that's within a religious environment, in a monastery, for instance, or near a temple. Now, this is often because people go to worship under those trees. If you've ever been to India or you've seen trees in India in populated places, they're covered in all sorts of adornments very often, or even have concrete building structures around them for people to make offerings. So they're not considered appropriate to sit and meditate under, let alone sleep under, dwell under. So this is referring to trees out in the wilderness alone. So it's a way of living under a tree if you don't have a forest to hand, I suppose. So I can't say I'd check that one either. We leave that one. Open air practice. Well, I did this for a long time in India, which is literally sleeping and living in the open air. And I've discussed that at length in the past. But currently, I'm living under the shelter of a roof, so I don't check that one. Number 12, any bed practice. This is Yata Santa Tikanga, where you are going to be happy to accept any form of bed, whatever's offered you, wherever you go to sleep on. Now, if I'm going somewhere to visit or travelling, then that is the case. And yes, check that. I wouldn't be fussy about what kind of sleeping arrangements are offered to me, as long as they are within my Vinaya rules, but it's not a commonly practiced, because we're normally staying in one place for more than a few nights for most of our time for practice, and I don't have a bed at all. I just sleep on the floor. So in that sense I can check it, because it doesn't matter. I have a woven what do you call it, raffia or grass or rush mat to lay on, but that's sufficient. So I'm not fussy about that, but it's not a specific practice of mine. And number 13 is sitting practice, which is nesachik anga. Nesachik is shortened to and referred to often as a practice we usually just adopt once or twice a month on the Uposatha night, when we're sitting up all night meditating, full moon and new moon. But some practitioners might choose to do this for an entire 3 months rains season, or for a week, a month, any length of time they determine. I don't observe this one. I find it very difficult. Even one day, I find that 24 hours is tricky. And so if I'm sitting up all night practicing nesachik for an all-night sitting on an Uposatha, usually that would be only when I'm in a temple or a monastery and wanting to bring a little more austerity into my practice, that is often living in a community where things are a little bit more comfortable and everything is more ready to hand. One can forget the austerity side that we're allowed, so can employ little practices like nesachik on occasions to remind oneself of these practices. But generally speaking, personally I find it quite difficult and need to at least lay down at some point during the day, just to give my body time to just settle in a different position. The Buddha says we can practice sitting, standing, walking or laying down, and nesachik is omitting the fourth posture, laying down. Even when sleeping, one would sit. Perhaps it's allowed to lean against a post or a column, a pillar, something like that, but not leaning all comfortably either way, here, there and everywhere. But just to doze off if one needs some sleep is just about acceptable, to lean about a pillar. But I've not employed that one. So really my own practices as far as the 13 are concerned are relating to clothing, rag wearers, rag robes wearers practice, the triple robes wearers practice, then on arms round the every house practice, the one sessioner practice when it comes to eating, and the eating from one's bowl only practice, and the late refuser of any additional food that may come along and be offered subsequently practice. As far as where I live, forest practice, I have done it in the past. Tree root dwellers practice I have also, to some extent. Open air practice I have also in the past, but subsequently now I choose the option of living alone but in an empty dwelling which has been made suitable and ready for me to occupy and provides adequate shelter. I missed out number 11, charnel ground practice. Now this I have also done. This is where you go and stay overnight in a cemetery, or as they're referred to in India, charnel grounds, the crematorium areas where the bodies are stored overnight and then burnt accordingly at the right time, appropriate to whomever's doing that. And you're amongst the end stages of life, not end stages of life, but the beginning stages of death, the decomposition, and then the disposal of the physical body. So it's a great reminder of impermanence in that sense. There is a video of me sitting or talking in a charnel ground in India. If you look up charnel ground, CHARNEL ground, under the English Buddhist Monk channel, you might find that, and you'll see some background of goings on there. And this is a practice that, for that reason, to bring about the sense of urgency in our practices, reminding us of death, the decomposition process and disposal of bodies. And they are also suitable places to go and practice, to stay. Certainly back in my own country in England, cemeteries are very peaceful, quiet places that are very well looked after. and even if you're not allowed to stay there overnight, and I have done that in England, I was able to get away with that quite okay, but even if you're not allowed to, you can spend a good part of your day sitting in a cemetery ground. So I'm talking about non-Buddhist countries where nobody's going to mind you sitting and practicing meditation, and they're very conducive to that. Like I've often said previously on occasions, that some other temples of other religions are very forgiving, accepting, obliging, and will allow you to go and use their buildings to sit in as good, quiet places of refuge. Now, you can't stay overnight, but good places to go and practice meditation during the day. Charnel grounds, from that point of view, fit very well with us Westerners, put it that way. But of course, a lot of people coming from the East have intense belief and fears of ghosts and spirits and other beings roaming around like hungry ghosts in these places, and don't find them conducive to practice at all. So use it as a tapas, a burning away of defilements, comforts practice by spending any time at all in such places. Me having no fear of such things, I just find them quite useful, comfortable, peaceful places. They also usually have water on hand for filling up, especially in the West, jars for flowers and putting on graves and such like, so you can get water easily, and I found them useful from that point of view. So apologies for missing number 11 out. And then finally the bed practice, any bed practice, the one that I don't have a bed, so I suppose you can say I do observe that one. So we'll say check to that one. So I check on number 12 too. So rag robes, triple robes, alms food only, every house, one sessioner, later or eating out of the bowl, late refused offerings, all of those and above. I practice the forest. No, I'm not in the forest. I'm not living under a tree. I'm not in the open air anymore, and I'm not in a charnel ground anymore. And I'm not wandering around accepting anywhere to sleep each and every night. So I'm not, usually this is traveling, when you're traveling on tudong, which comes from the word dutanga and is a Thai derivative of a wanderer's practice, or one would refer to it in the Pali as charaka, was one who's walking from A to B. So a charaka monk is one who doesn't stay in one place any more than 1 or 2 or maybe at the maximum 3 nights and keeps wandering. They would be observing number 12, any bed practice, which would they stay in anything from temples or monasteries to people who have suitable accommodation in their houses who might offer it in accordance with the rules and the practice, to sleeping in any of those aforementioned environments. So that is those 13 Dutanga practices covered in some detail. I hope for those who've not heard that before, that wasn't too boring. It's not very useful, really, other than to see the way that monks may or may not observe these in their living environments and bring them into their own practice. I try to certainly observe what we wear and what we eat, all of those, and to some extent, where I live, keeping it all very simple and basic, and not dwelling within a community or in a city, in a town, and to some extent therefore cover the other aspects of these Dutanga practices. And what the Buddha's teaching us with regards to overall the practice is to be careful about too much austerity, and always remember it is the middle path. Now, of course, this is very subjective in accordance with what you're used to in your own current environment, and although I find that this is very comfortable where I'm living and what I'm offered here, and I'm very grateful for it, others might not. Others might require a little bit more comfort by way of furnishings, even to the extent of air conditioning, things like that, and shuttable windows and doors and other luxuries, which I don't really find necessary or even appropriate for my practice. I think being really with nature, amongst nature, and dealing with all of the I won't say foreboding, because nothing is that foreboding, but all of the hurdles one has to overcome on occasions with living in these environments is really part of experience and dealing with our reactions, seeing how we react mentally and physically towards these obstacles in the way of our practice, and therefore getting a good view and insight into how our equanimity is developing towards all of these things. Now, I recently just had to have a little trip into a big city in another country by means of public transport and via a big city here in Sri Lanka. So I went from Colombo to Chennai for my usual visa run and quickly returned. But it was an experience of the modern world as close as I get to that on any occasion. And in a way, I'm quite glad it's only every 6 months, and it's enough. But it's also quite useful because I can appreciate how living in samsara is. I never forget it. I don't lose sight of it because I get to see it on these occasions. I see the huge amounts of advertising that's going on all around, most of which I don't even understand these days what it's advertising, but all of also the food eateries and options that are available for food. Daunting for me, as you see from observing those practices, the Jutanga practices, just in relation to my own food. That kind of makes my own eating practices seem complicated, but when one has the choice of so many different culturally influenced foods in such places of big cities like Colombo or Chennai, then it's very confusing to someone like me. But I was able to find I was offered sufficient food without having to inquire too much at all, and was able to rely on, in that situation, in those circumstances, on the support, the reassurance of the Vinaya behind me, the rules that I have to observe by way of food having to be offered, by way that I'm not allowed to buy it myself. I didn't have to go on Pindapata. Very often in airport and travelling places from one Buddhist country even to a non-Buddhist country, you will be looked after by locals and practitioners of Buddhism, or even people whom aren't, who see you are a monk of some kind and perhaps require, even if it comes about in conversation, will offer you just enough to get by for such a short time, 24 hours. But just looking around and seeing the choice people have of different options, from, pizzas to burgers to chicken things to then all of the vegetarian options, all of the various foods that are on choice there, I'm somewhat reassured and glad and happy not to have such a confusing array of choice, and to just have to be happy with what I'm offered. When I say have to be happy, I am happy with what I'm offered. Not to have all that choice and decision, and to keep everything very simple. So this is where those remembering of those little Jutanga practices that might be there when travelling certainly come about into the foreground. You can use them to support you, as monks and nuns do. So on that note, I hope there's something useful there, and if not, then just let it go. Until next time, be happy and stay well. Sukhi Hotu.